Hello, world, and welcome to the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterland, coming to you from the vacation destination known as Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and this is episode 93. This is definitely going to be a unique and special episode of the podcast for reasons I'll let you know in a minute. But otherwise, coming up on this episode as Thanksgiving is approaching, we're going to take a look at some of the places that the Pilgrims walked on Cape Cod since they originally landed at Provincetown and then went to Plymouth. We're going to go way back in the day and look at part one of probably a list of 3 musicians that came from New England, famous musicians that came from New England. There's going to be a brand new top 5. These are the top 5 symbols of the 80s, what you think of when you hear 1980s, the decade. And there'll be a brand new This Week in History and Time Capsule, all coming up right now on episode 93 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Welcome into what's going to be a fun, unique, and different episode of the podcast. Not for anything that I'm doing, but for something that happened in the time since I recorded the last one. So those that paid attention to the end of episode 92 might notice that when I gave the rundown of what's coming in this episode, there was something missing. And that was the road trip to Pawtucket, Rhode Island. That I will do coming up likely in episode 95. But something kind of important came up that I felt needed to be addressed on this week's podcast. And that is the fact that the Lady of the Dunes herself has been identified by local FBI. So in just a minute, I'm going to dive into everything I know, everything I've heard from the press conference, from talking to Frank, the director of the documentary, and such. And don't worry, I won't leave you in that much suspense. But before I dive into it, I wanted to take a few minutes, as always, to thank everyone for listening. October was my best month for downloads by a lot. I'm so appreciative to all of you that have tuned in, that have shared it, that have made it appointment listening for yourself. If you want to donate, you can buy me a coffee. Go to buymeacoffee.com. Find the In My Footsteps podcast. Search for Cape Cod in New England, and you will find me. Any donations go towards advertising the podcast, so you're basically helping me promote this show even better. And I'm sure near the end of the podcast, I'll go deeper into my thanks and my promotions, etc., that I do every week. But I always want to make sure I thank you, the people that are listening, before I get into any content, because without you, this doesn't exist. Because I'm more than 2 years in, and if I didn't have an audience that actually tuned into the show, I wouldn't bother. As much as I love doing it, it still wouldn't feel worth it. But let's get out of this. I'll leave you in suspense no more. Let's dive right into this huge story that broke on Halloween Day with the Lady of the Dunes being identified, finally, right now on episode 93 of the In My Footsteps podcast. When I woke up on Halloween morning, I never could have predicted how the day was going to go. I had my costume for work. I had to leave early because I had blown a tire a few days earlier and had been driving around on a donut, so I had to go to the town of Orleans and get 2 new tires for my car. That was the excitement I thought for the day. As I drove Route 6A, trying to go as slow as I could to not have the donut blow out on the way to getting new tires, I noticed my phone starting to blow up. It was Frank, the producer of the Lady of the Dunes documentary. If you've never listened to this podcast and you don't know who Frank is, go back to episode 62, listen to my interview that I did with him. He's become a huge part of my life over the last year and a half and is a very talented and very important to things that are going on. When I finally was able to call Frank back, he had left me a text saying there was a press conference in Provincetown. At 11, they were going to identify the Lady of the Dunes, which immediately my heart went like fluttering. It turned out that the press conference was in Boston. It was just the Provincetown police chief was at it. It was just a little bit of misinformation because I was going to try to drive to Provincetown to go to the press conference. Hell, I had even called my work to say I was going to be late, and I explained what was going on, but I said, I promise I'll be there. I just have to go to this press conference. I ended up downloading the NBC 10 Boston app on my phone so I could watch the press conference. And fittingly, I went to the beach near the dunes to be by myself to just watch when it unfolded. And before anyone actually spoke, there was stock footage that they were filming before that was on the live stream, so there was no sound, but whoever was filming zoomed in on the photos. And there were 4 photos of this woman, and it was the craziest thing. It was like worlds colliding when I saw the actual face of the Lady of the Dunes and her actual name, Ruth Marie Terry. That is the Lady of the Dunes. And to have an image in your head, I've worked so closely with the book about searching for the Lady of the Dunes and having kind of an image in your head of what you think she looks like, and then to actually see who she is, and it was not what I expected. I can't remember if in the press conference they said it was forensic DNA. It was something like that, genetic DNA. That's how they found who she was. Ruth Marie Terry was from Tennessee. She was born September 8th, 1936, 5'6.5", 146 pounds, which made her 37 years old at the time of her death. So she ended up being older than I expected. I thought she was in her mid-20s. The most shocking part was the fact that she had a husband and a child. I had always assumed the Lady of the Dunes was kind of a transient, single young woman just out traveling, doing whatever. I never expected her to be a wife and a mother. I just remember sitting at this picnic table at the beach, surrounded by the beach, seeing these photos of Ruth Marie Terry and just saying out loud, "It's you. It's nice to see you. Nice to see you, Ruth." And those of you that are familiar with me, with the podcast, with the book that I've written, you've likely seen my videos, the Searching for the Lady of the Dunes video, and then the Cape Cod True Crime one about the Lady of the Dunes and Tony Costa, where I have video of Stephen the Medium and Susan the Happy Cape Cod Medium as we go to spots that are relevant to both of those cases. So you know the connection that I kind of feel to the Lady of the Dunes, to this case. I've mentioned it so many times on this podcast that what I wanted to do, what Frank wanted to do with this documentary was give her her name back. And I believe that Frank has definitely had a huge hand in this happening. Needless to say, on Halloween Day, my phone was blowing up with people. Some of them were congratulating me because they know of my hard work on the book. And I would laugh and say, I didn't do anything. I basically just chronicled the process of Frank making the documentary and what he went through. Without Frank, this book I'm doing doesn't exist. So as happy as I am that she has her name, I can't take any credit for it. An interesting little nugget is that during Halloween Day, during that day, one of Frank's contacts, who was high up in law enforcement, I'm not going to get any deeper than that, I'm going to keep it vague, someone that was important to the documentary and to the book, made it a point to call Frank and tell him that his documentary, his hard work, his perseverance helped lead to Ruth Marie Terry being identified as the Lady of the Dunes. And yes, that Halloween Day and everything that went down will now be the new ending to the book. If you go to NBC 10, so it's a Boston television station, if you go to their website, you can watch the press conference as it aired live. It's like 22 minutes. You will see the photos. They have the FBI sheet seeking information. I'm looking at it right now. And if by chance you have any information on Ruth Marie Terry, I think they're looking for more in-depth look into her life, why she was on Cape Cod, because a 37-year-old wife and mother being out here from Tennessee, it kind of doesn't make sense. Whereas if she was a 24-year-old single, just out of college girl working here for the summer, that was always the story I thought. So it's exciting yet confusing because this is not the person that I expected. So the Lady of the Dunes has her name. She is Ruth Marie Terry. So what happens now? Naturally, FBI, local law enforcement, they're going to start looking into who killed her. They had said in the press conference that the killer or killers could be anywhere from their late 60s to older and potentially dead. In the book, even though I said ad nauseum that the purpose of the book was to give her name back, we dive deep into who potentially could have killed her and why she was here and who she could have been associated with. So even though she has her name, the suspects that could be responsible for her murder still make the book very relevant. Frank and I are still planning on going out to where Ruth Marie Terry was found dead in the dunes in Provincetown with Stephen the medium. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of communication he gets, especially knowing her name. I plan on doing an audio podcast interview and also a video interview out there. So you'll get all the information coming up in the upcoming weeks. And I'll likely chat again with Susan, the Cape Cod Happy Medium, see what she's feeling about this, if there's anything that comes to light. And I also plan on writing the new ending to the book, because even though she now has her name, the rest of her story is still up in the air. Why did a 37-year-old wife and mother from Tennessee end up in the dunes way out in remote Race Point Beach? Who killed her and why, and how did she end up out there? And what of the killer or killers? Are they still around? Are they still local? Are they in Provincetown? Are they on the outer Cape? Who knows? I was stunned and in shock at first that she actually was named and on Halloween. And then my mind naturally selfishly went to, oh, how does this affect my book? What do I do? But then the story got sadder, knowing that she was a wife and mother, knowing that there's a family that they have been looking for her. Someone in the family put out the missing persons bulletin way back in the day. It's just sometimes the wheels of justice take almost a half century. So it's almost like the idea of moving the goalposts, as the phrase goes, when you attain a goal but you still don't feel completely fulfilled. I had nothing to do with the Lady of the Dunes getting her name back. Frank had a huge part of it, and that's been confirmed by higher-ups in law enforcement that helped him with the documentary. But now that she actually has her name, which was something that we didn't know would ever happen, now the whole tone changes to who killed her and why. So I'm not done with the book. The book's tone is going to stay similar, but now that she has her name, now I am focused on who killed her. I had said it didn't matter to me because I honestly thought just getting her name back was going to be the hardest part, but it's not. I'm looking right at her face. So now it comes down to who killed the Lady of the Dunes, who killed Ruth Marie Terry, and why. The case is currently being investigated as a homicide by the Massachusetts State Police, assigned to the Office of the Cape and Islands District Attorney, the Provincetown Police Department, and the FBI. If you have any information concerning the murder of Ruth Marie Terry, please contact the FBI's toll-free tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI or the Massachusetts State Police at 1-800-CAPTURE, that's KAPTURE, or submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov or msptips@pol.state.mass.us. And let's all try to help bring Ruth Marie Terry, a.k.a. the Lady of the Dunes' killer or killers, to justice. Thanksgiving time is coming up again. That means turkey, football, and family for most. However, all of these blessed events and traditions wouldn't be possible if not for a group of English settlers known as the Pilgrims. The collection of 102 passengers aboard the famed Mayflower ship is most commonly connected with their landing in the future Plymouth colony. However, they have a large connection to Cape Cod, because it is on Cape Cod where the Pilgrims first walked and explored in the New World. First off, a little bit of the journey of the Mayflower. It was the initial intention of the Pilgrims to land somewhere in present-day Northern Virginia. The ship was to be accompanied to the New World by a vessel named the Speedwell. This ship was cursed, though. It seemed as, even on its way to meet the Mayflower in Southampton in July 1620 in Britain, it began leaking. In fact, the pair of vessels departed twice from England, only to have to return to port when the Speedwell began leaking again. Finally, on September 6th, the Mayflower left Plymouth, England, to cross the Atlantic Ocean on its own. 66 days later, the Mayflower found land and docked. However, this was not Northern Virginia. It was Cape Cod, more than 400 miles north of where they intended to go. And what I'm going to share with you now are the locations on Cape Cod where the Pilgrims explored on the Cape, and you can go explore them still today, if you're on Cape Cod. The first spot is known today as Pilgrims' First Landing Park on Commercial Street in Provincetown. On November 11th, 1620, the Mayflower circled around the tip of Provincetown and docked in Provincetown Harbor. These first steps on shore by the Pilgrims are commemorated here at the Rotary at the west end of Commercial Street. There is a plaque which celebrates this moment of not just American but world history as well. The location was actually discovered via a map in the 1622 book Mort's Relation, written by Edward Winslow and William Bradford. And this was actually a first-hand account of the Pilgrims landing at this spot, and thus the map is seen as very accurate. Next up, number 2 is the Pilgrim Monument on High Pole Hill Road in Provincetown. This granite tower was erected in 1910 overlooking the harbor. It's 252 feet tall and stands 350 feet above sea level. It's one of the biggest icons of Cape Cod and can be seen from most places on the Cape. If you've never been up to the top, the view is simply incredible. The first stone of the tower was laid by then-President Theodore Roosevelt in 1907, and it's a very fitting tribute to the colonists. And although it's not directly tied to the Pilgrims' Landing, it's still an impressive attraction and one of the best-known locations on Cape Cod. We start to head south for number 3, which is Pilgrim Spring Trail on Pilgrim Heights Road in Truro. This trail leads through the woods out to a breathtaking scenic overlook of the dunes and the ocean from a raised vantage point. From the overlook, it is a quick walk to a plaque telling the tale of the Pilgrims' first drink of fresh water in the new land. On November 16th, 1620, an exploring party came upon a spring from which they drank. There is a small pool there to this day, but it's not certain if this is the very same spring that's been there since 400 years ago. So I can't verify that, and I don't know if you want to drink out of it if you go there, so don't tempt yourself. Next up, number 4 is Pilgrim Pond, which is on Pond Road in Truro. It was here that a group of 16 pilgrims, led by Miles Standish and William Bradford, spent their second night on the shores of Cape Cod. Compared to some of the others on this list, it's an unassuming piece of history with a small park, complete with a couple of benches along the water. The best view of the pond in general is a short walk from the park, but overall it's difficult to see much of the water. So don't go there looking for a lot of great photo opportunities, because it's still a marvelous chapter of the Pilgrim story on Cape Cod, but it's more of a close your eyes and imagine the Pilgrims being there rather than having a whole lot of photo opportunities or plaques and everything like that. 5th on the list of places where the Pilgrims walked on Cape Cod is Cornhill and Cornhill Beach, which is on Cornhill Road in Truro. It was near the beach on November 16th, 1620, that the same group of 16 pilgrims that I had mentioned at Pilgrim Pond came upon a Wampanoag stash of corn and fresh water, which they stole and used to sustain their people. The physical Cornhill stands upward of 100 feet above sea level. The views are somewhat limited today due to the homes that dot the area atop the hill, but it is possible to drive the road to the top and gaze down at Little Pamet River to the south and get kind of a taste of that amazing panoramic scenery on the outer Cape. And the sixth and final spot is First Encounter Beach, which is on Samoset Road in Eastham. The first encounter that the name speaks of is the one between that group of 16 pilgrims led by Miles Standish and William Bradford and the Nauset tribe of the Wampanoag Native Americans. On December 8th, 1620, the two groups met along the beach here. Earlier European explorers had visited and even captured members of the Nauset tribe, leaving them rightfully with a bad taste in their mouth about white travelers. Thusly, the first encounter consisted of arrows being slung from the Nauset tribe and musket fire being directed by the Pilgrims. In the end, both sides retreated, and as far as records show, nobody was killed or wounded, which is good. As a result of this encounter, the Pilgrims decided to look elsewhere for a settlement, fearing more hostile interactions with the local Native Americans. Within days, the Mayflower set sail across Cape Cod Bay and landed at Plymouth on December 16th, 1620, where the new settlement began. Cape Cod would not see another attempted settlement until 1628, when Plymouth Colony established the Aptuxet Trading Post in present-day Bourne. It was created to allow settlers to trade with local natives and traveling Dutch sailors. That was a trading post, though, and not an actual village. In 1637, the town of Sandwich was formed and gave the Cape its first true settlement. So it was 17 years after the Pilgrims had left the Cape. In 5 weeks on Cape Cod, the Pilgrims explored much of the Bayside coast from Provincetown down through Eastham. Their footprints are all over the land, and their influence as well. And due to these 6 places I named not being that far from each other, you can explore all of them, and in pretty short order. So take a few moments this Thanksgiving season to walk where they walked and feel that history and the importance of this English settlement that came to Cape Cod and then Plymouth over 400 years ago. And then after that, kick back and enjoy some food, football, and family. Because I think that's the true lasting legacy of the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving. This week in history, we are going back 82 years ago to November 7th, 1940, and the infamous collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. I think a lot of you will be familiar with this when I start to give you the story. This bridge was constructed during the late 1930s before finally being opened to traffic on July 1st, 1940. It spanned Puget Sound from Gig Harbor to Tacoma. At the time of its opening, it was the third longest suspension bridge in the world, covering 5,959 feet. So far, so good. The problem started when Maine designer Leon Moisseiff designed the bridge to be the most flexible bridge ever constructed. The bridge was sleek and slender, and even though it exceeded the ratios of length, depth, and width that was seen to be appropriate, the bridge was deemed to be totally safe, which is why it opened on July 1st, 1940. The area of Puget Sound where the bridge was constructed is 40 miles south of Seattle and was about a mile wide where the bridge was. The engineers didn't take into consideration the forces that were applied by high winds in that area. When they were constructing the bridge, they never took that into consideration. So the bridge being too long, too thin, flexible, over Puget Sound. When the wind started to pick up, the bridge was prone to sway back and forth. It got the nickname Gallopin' Gertie, which is never something you want for a bridge. On November 7th, high winds started pounding the bridge. It started swaying. At 11 a.m., concrete started falling from the road surface. And only minutes later, a 600-foot section of the bridge collapsed down into the water. Luckily, nobody was on the bridge out there and nobody was hurt. But there's a very famous video of this collapse happening, and it looks like it's not real. The bridge was being tossed side to side, up and down. If you watch the video, it's crazy. At one point, one sidewalk on one side was 28 feet above the sidewalk on the other side. Even though it was made of strong structural carbon steel, it was no match for those winds. Investigations after the fact said that the collapse of the bridge was inevitable. It was just a matter of when and not if. On October 14th, 1950, the replacement Tacoma Narrows Bridge was finished. It is currently the 5th longest suspension bridge in America, and luckily the engineers took into consideration what happened to Gallopin' Gertie, and this bridge has been structurally sound for over 70 years. But go check out the video, because the collapse of the original Tacoma Narrows Bridge took place 82 years ago this week in history. And now it's time for a brand new time capsule. We're going back 32 years ago this week to November 11th, 1990. And let's see what was going on in the world of pop culture back then. The number one song was Love Takes Time by Mariah Carey. This was off of her self-titled debut album. This was Mariah Carey's second single off the album and second straight number one song. I mean, she hit the ground running. It spent a total of 3 weeks at number one, and not ironically, Mariah Carey's third single off the album, Someday, became her third consecutive number one single in a row. The number one movie was Child's Play 2. This is the sequel to the original with Chucky, the killer doll that has the soul of a serial killer inside of him as he keeps trying to get his soul into Andy to take over his body. If you've never seen the original Child's Play, you've got to see it. Now it's more of a campy parody of a horror movie, although they say the TV show is good. It made over $35 million at the box office on a budget of about $13 million. And although it's got a 40% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, it's still a worthy sequel because it still had Alex Vincent as Andy and, of course, Brad Dourif as the voice of Chucky. But that's it. You can skip Child's Play 3 and the rest. The number one TV show was Cheers. This is considered to be, if not just one of the greatest sitcoms of the 80s, one of the best of all time, about the Boston-based bar, the cast of clients and the people that worked there. By this point, it was Ted Danson, Woody Harrelson, Kirstie Alley, Kelsey Grammer, and a whole bunch of others. Cheers ran for 11 seasons from 1982 to 1993 and a total of 275 episodes. And it's still widely beloved and remembered, and it's got the theme song that everybody knows. Where everybody knows your name, you can hear it now. And if you were around back then, November 11th, 1990, if you wanted to feel like a big shot, a high roller, you could go to Radio Shack and get yourself a CT301 handheld cellular phone. That's right, a cell phone. This cell phone weighed 28 ounces, so more than 1.5 pounds. It's like a brick. You could do 1.5 hours of talking on a full battery charge. Luckily, it had a rechargeable battery and an antenna. Ooh. This cell phone would set you back $999 or $2,268 in today's money. Now take a moment and step back and think about how expensive the newest iPhones are and all that you get with it. And then think about paying even more for that in today's money for what I just described with that CT301. No internet, no apps, a shorter battery life, and a phone that you could probably kill someone with if you threw it at them. But that's going to wrap up another This Week in History, another time capsule. But now we're really going to kick up the nostalgia as we do a brand new top 5. These are the top 5 symbols of the 80s. This is at least what I think of when someone says describe the 80s. Let's see what you think coming up now. So if someone asks you to describe the 80s, what you think of the 80s, what makes it up, what pops into your head besides being younger if you're my age? Well, this week's top 5 is going to be symbols of the 80s, leaning more in towards society and culture and less on actual news stories. because I feel doing a top 5 news stories of the decade would be something separate on its own. As a child of the 80s, though, I came up with so many things on this list that I had to whittle down. As with the majority of these top 5s, they're in no particular order. These are all just from my head. It's all subjective. And of course, I've got some honorable mentions to kind of whet your appetite for what's coming. So close your eyes and let's go back to the 1980s, starting with these honorable mentions. They include Michael Jackson, Care Bears, Pac-Man, Eddie Murphy, Air Jordans, and leg warmers. That's a lot of honorable mentions and a lot of good memories of the 80s. Did those bring you back in the day? Well, let's get into the actual top 5. Symbols of the 1980s. Number 1, Rubik's Cube. Especially in the first half of the 1980s, it seemed like everybody had one of these puzzle games. The cube with all the different colored squares that you had to line up and get all the same colors on the same side. It was invented in 1974 by a Hungarian sculptor and professor of architecture, Erno Rubik, and he called it the Magic Cube, but in the 1980s it exploded. As of 2021, it's said that more than 450 million Rubik's Cubes have been sold. Do you have one? Number 2 is MTV. Going on the air in August 1981, this was a cultural landmark, a shift in entertainment. An actual TV channel dedicated to only music had never been seen before. It was cool, young, hip. The original DJs became instant celebrities. Martha Quinn, Mark Goodman, Nina Blackwood, Alan Hunter, and J.J. Jackson. Every musician wanted to have their videos on there. It made instant celebrities out of Michael Jackson, Prince, Madonna, and others that became more famous for their music videos than the music itself. But we won't get into what MTV is today. We all know it hasn't been real music television in like 20 years. Number 3 is the Nintendo Entertainment System. Although it had been around in Japan for years earlier, it was in 1985 when it broke through in America with Super Mario Brothers and the Duck Hunt combination you could get. Video games had been a big thing for years earlier with the Atari 2600, but the failure of the E.T. video game for Atari, which may or may not have led to the video game crash of 1983, it nearly killed the industry. The crash, not the E.T. game. But it looked like video games were going to be a flash in the pan. Can you imagine that? And then Nintendo came along. Now you're playing with power. But after Super Mario Brothers, you had all these legendary games. Metroid, Legend of Zelda, Castlevania, later on Tetris, Mega Man. I could go on forever. And by the end of the 80s came the Game Boy, and Nintendo just dominated. Even though Sega tried to make a run, and then PlayStation has done well in the 90s up to now, but in the 80s, it was ruled by Nintendo. And it was a symbol of cool if you had your own Nintendo. Number 4 is New Wave music. New Wave was just that, a totally new genre of music. It was a blending of a lot of stuff. Rock, punk, a little bit of alternative, a lot of synth pop. It grew to fame along with MTV. They kind of held hands and got big together. Your opinion of what makes new wave music might be different from mine, but bands like Devo, Aha, The Buggles, Oingo Boingo, The Human League, Psychedelic Furs. There's a whole lot of one-hit wonders that came from new wave. It's easy to find. Just go on Spotify and find someone's new wave playlist, and you'll know all those songs. And finally, number 5 on the list of top 5 symbols of the 1980s is the Sony Walkman. You see and hear the music on MTV. You go and buy your favorite cassette from whichever new wave band you just heard, and then you plug it into your own portable cassette player, the Sony Walkman. This was another thing that if you were cool, you had a Sony Walkman. Especially in the mid to late 80s, everyone had the Walkman with those crappy headphones that you could probably bend with 2 fingers that had the really weak foam over the ears. But you could play your tapes wherever you went. Granted, it would kill the batteries pretty fast, but still, you had your own music. You could be wherever you wanted and not bother people around you. And once it became more readily easy to make mixtapes, then you were really going. You could make your mix and go where you wanted to go and listen to it. It was just part of that freedom that you felt in the 80s into the early to mid 90s. Where, like I've said before, it's not like kids back then, we didn't just come and go as we pleased, but at times it felt like that. But that wraps up this top 5. What did you think of these symbols of the 1980s? The Rubik's Cube, MTV, Nintendo, New Wave music, and the Walkman. Did you have them, use them, listen to them, watch them? Let me know if you had totally different symbols of the 80s that you think of. Maybe I'll do a second list. So if you sit back and think of the hubs of music in the United States, where do you think of? New York City, Southern California, maybe New Orleans. I'm sure most of you don't think of New England as being a hub of music, but you might be surprised. I know I was. And what we're going to do now is go way, way back in the day and look at some of the most famous musicians that came from New England. Interestingly, I initially intended this to be a single part, single segment, in and out, and we're done. Only when I started to do my research of famous musicians from the 6 New England states did I realize I have enough to do at least 2, if not 3 segments. So how I'm going to do this is kind of a list, kind of a countdown. This whole show has been nothing but lists, where the Pilgrims walked, symbols of the 80s, and now the musicians from New England. So I hope you like lists, because I got a lot of them this week. Now again, famous is all subjective. I'm going to name some of these artists in these segments, and you might be like, I'd never heard of them, or I don't like them. So I'll give you the reasons why they're on here. Some will be obvious, some will not. The very first name on the list here is very obvious, and that's Aerosmith from Massachusetts. Now, granted, Aerosmith originally formed in New Hampshire, but they really struck it big in Boston. And just to set a little guideline, when I picked these musicians and artists from New England, they had to either be born here or the band itself had to be formed here. So there are some that were born outside of New England but moved here and got famous, but I'm trying to keep it as born and bred here in New England. Aerosmith was one of the biggest rock bands of the 70s. They had a huge comeback in the mid to late 80s, and they stayed huge and relevant up. I mean, they're still relevant, but they were making hit music all the way up into the mid 2000s. Steven Tyler, the front man, Joe Perry, Joey Kramer, Brad Whitford, Tom Hamilton. They had so many huge songs, too many to name, but they're a Hall of Fame band and they're from New England. And hell, they were on The Simpsons, too. So that you know they're huge if they're on The Simpsons. So that's an easy one to name. The next one is Bill Conti, who's from Rhode Island. Now, if you don't know the name Bill Conti, if I tell you that he came up with pretty much all of the famous music from the Rocky movies, then you'll know. He wrote Gonna Fly Now, which is known as the Rocky theme. You can hear it in your head. All those Rocky songs are great for working out at the gym, but he also wrote the music in all of the Karate Kid movies and the movie The Right Stuff, which got him an Academy Award for Best Original Score. Another one that everyone should know if you're from New England is the Dropkick Murphys from Massachusetts. Shipping Up to Boston is... everyone knows that song from around here. Even if you don't know the name, you play the music and you know it. It's at all the sporting events locally. They started in Quincy in 1996, with singer and bassist Ken Casey being the only person that's been in there from beginning to now. Their first hit was 2004's cover of the song Tessie that went along with the Boston Red Sox rise to their first World Series in 86 years. So they'll be forever beloved in New England. But then there's Extreme from Massachusetts. Not saying they're not beloved, but it's a little different. They were kind of rock, led by Gary Cherone. Their big hit was More Than Words in 1990, and then they had Wholehearted, which was pretty good. So for a time in the early 90s, Extreme was a pretty big deal. But they quickly faded away, with Gary Cherone even going to be the lead singer of Van Halen very temporarily for like one album. But they have sold more than 10 million albums worldwide, and More Than Words did go to number 1 on the Billboard charts. But then a surprise one came up, and that's the Carpenters from Connecticut. Siblings Karen and Richard Carpenter. They were a huge duo in the 1970s. I guess it's soft, I don't want to say rock, more folk maybe. They had huge hits in the 70s with Close to You, We've Only Just Begun. And there's a lot more than just those two. Their music is good for either a rainy afternoon or maybe a summer sunset. It is very 70s. They've sold more than 100 million albums worldwide, so they were a pretty big deal. And then there's Mark McGrath, the lead singer of Sugar Ray from Connecticut. Sugar Ray hit it big in the late 90s with hits like Fly, Every Morning, Someday, and they stayed relevant through the mid-2000s. The band has also sold more than 10 million albums, and they've had 4 top 10 singles, plus probably making tons of money on streaming songs and concerts. Plus, Mark McGrath has been on a lot of TV shows like Extra, and he's done a lot of other work on TV, so he's had a pretty damn good career. Speaking of good careers, there's New Kids on the Block from Massachusetts, the king of boy bands from the 1980s, with songs like The Right Stuff, Please Don't Go Girl, I'll Be Loving You Forever. In the late 80s, they were gigantic. I know just in my house, my sister Kate adored them. Jonathan and Jordan Knight, Donnie Wahlberg, Danny Wood, and Joey McIntyre. That was the crew. They have sold more than 70 million albums worldwide, and they even have had a comeback recently, doing a tour and an album with Backstreet Boys. And yes, I definitely think that the rise of New Kids on the Block led to the rise of the 90s boy bands like Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, and to a lesser extent 98 Degrees. So you have them to thank or blame. But hey, they're local. And we're sticking in Massachusetts for the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones. Ska reggae type music. They formed in 1983 and actually only recently disbanded. Lead vocalist Dickie Barrett had a unique sound. They hit their peak in 1997 with the song The Impression That I Get. That was kind of when the ska, punk, swing type music had its big resurgence briefly. And even though they've now broken up, they still left a huge catalog of music, including 11 studio albums that you can go and listen to and get acquainted with them. I think they were kind of underrated, so it was good that they got a moment in the sun in the late 90s. Then we skip on down to Rhode Island again for the band Tavares. It was a disco-era funk band with members of the band being born in New Bedford and Providence, but they officially got together in Rhode Island, so that's where I kind of dropped them in the bucket. Their biggest hit was Heaven Must Be Missing an Angel from 1976. That was a top 20 song. But they were a big-time band in that era for disco. If you went clubbing in the late 1970s, chances are you danced to a Tavares song. And last but not least on this part 1 from musicians from New England is the band The Lemonheads from Massachusetts. They were formed in 1986 in Boston. They were kind of a lesser-known alt band. If you've never heard of them, their biggest hit was Into Your Arms, which is from 1993. And that was a great song, still a great song. And they're still around. I don't know if they're currently touring or anything, but that's a fitting place to leave off for this first list. So did any of those bands or musicians surprise you as far as being from New England? I got a lot more, and I'm not going to just do 3 in a row, 3 weeks. I'm going to kind of space them out, give them room to breathe. But what I might do if you're interested is put together a Spotify playlist. So I'd start with these 10 artists and their biggest hits and then add to it, so that if you're curious about the musicians from this area that made it big, you can listen to it. So I think I'll do that, and then it's up to you if you want to listen to it or not. But yeah, at some point there'll be a part 2 and probably a part 3, musicians from New England. This is just the start. For now, though, that's going to do it. That's going to wrap up episode 93 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Thank you so much for coming and hanging out with me for about an hour. I appreciate all of you that check this podcast out. For me, it's a labor of love and talking about all the things I like about life. But then seeing the downloads, getting messages from some of you, it makes me even more excited to do these and keep going forward. And like I said at the top, my apologies to those of you from Pawtucket that might have been listening, and I was going to do the road trip segment. I'll do that in episode 95, as long as nothing big comes up, breaking news like the Lady of the Dunes getting identified. That kind of threw everything for a loop this week. For those of you that can't get enough of me, you can find me all over social media, Twitter, Instagram, my Facebook fan page, the In My Footsteps podcast blog at blogger.com. Check out my YouTube page, which has really been hitting its stride. I'm thrilled with so many people that have been checking out my videos, specifically my Lady of the Dunes related ones, which I've got a link for one of them in the description of the podcast, but if you go to my page, you can see them all. If you want to support the podcast, you can donate at buymeacoffee.com. Like I said, find the In My Footsteps podcast. But there's no pressure to do that. The best way to do it is to share the podcast, tell others, spread the word of mouth. Another great way is by going and checking out Kiwi's Customs at Etsy.com, both spelled with K's. Kaylee Marks is extremely talented and only getting more skilled with her crocheting. She's learning to knit and quilt and sew from my mother. So she's got baklavas, cat and dog sweaters. She has jewelry she makes, little stuffed animals that are really cute, and it costs nothing to look. I got the link in the description of the podcast, and I bet if you do go and look, you will find something. The holidays are coming up. What better gift to give someone than something that's handcrafted and homemade from Cape Cod? And like I've said, she takes requests. If you go to her page at Etsy and you see something that looks close to something you might like, send her a message. She will do her best to make what you want. So go down there, click the link in the description of the podcast, and visit Kiwi's Customs, both spelled with K's, at Etsy.com. Coming up next week is episode 94, the last one before Thanksgiving, because I will not be doing a podcast to release on Thanksgiving that Thursday, because who's going to listen to it? Episode 94, we're going to look back at a forgotten legend of Cape Cod nightlife, the Panama Club from Hyannis. We're going to continue the Thanksgiving theme as we take a road trip to where the Pilgrims eventually settled, the second largest town in New England, Plymouth, Massachusetts. We're going to go way, way back in the day and look at Michael Jackson's landmark Thriller album 40 years later. Good Lord, 40 years. There's going to be a brand new top 5 that are going to be the top 5 weirdest old Thanksgiving foods and recipes that I researched that are just crazy. Hopefully you don't make any of these. And of course, there'll be a brand new This Week in History and Time Capsule, all coming up next week on episode 94 of the In My Footsteps podcast. And I couldn't finish up this week without taking a few minutes to wish a very special happy birthday to my mom, Laurie. It'll be coming up in a few days, so it'll be gone before the next podcast episode hits, and I wanted to make sure you heard this before. You know, in so many ways, what I do in life, my content creation, the podcast, books, etc., I'm trying to be the best and the biggest version of myself I possibly can be. And in so many ways, it's to kind of validate all of the hard work my mother did raising me. For a time, she was a single mother of 5 children going full-time to nursing school, working full-time, so that we kids could have it better than she did. And as I get older, I'm still trying to do all I can to make my mother proud and to kind of validate all she did. So I hope you have a happy birthday coming up and know that I love you very much. And I hope that all I do and all I am and who I am makes you proud. And I'll keep on working hard to try to be the best version of myself I can be. For you and for me, of course. So happy birthday to my mom, Laurie, in advance. And for all the rest of you out there, thank you so much for tuning into this podcast. Always lean into the things that make you happy. Protect and cultivate your mental health, because at the end of the day, that's most important, and sometimes that's all you've got. And remember, in this life, don't walk in anyone else's footsteps. Create your own path. Leave the biggest footprint you possibly can and enjoy every moment on this journey, because you never know what tomorrow brings. Whatever you do, enjoy it, have fun, be safe. This has been the In My Footsteps podcast. I have been Christopher Setterland, and I will talk to you all again soon.